And welcome to The World This Week, right here on France 24, where we take a look back at some of the defining stories of the week with a panel of journalists from around the world. In the studio, we have Vivian Walt, the correspondent of Time magazine here in Paris. Thanks for being with us. And Stacey Mektrey, the bureau chief of the Paris bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, as well as Lila Jacinto, a senior editor and reporter right here at France 24. Also joining us live from Brussels, Dave Clark, news editor at AFP, Agence France Presse. And let's start with that public primetime hearing in Washington conducted by the January 6th investigative committee, and which has thrust Donald Trump back in the headlines, a marathon presentation to the American public of what happened on that day in 2021, where a crowd of Trump supporters, some in civilian attire, others dressed in tactical gear, stormed the Capitol and seemingly attempted to disrupt and overturn the counting of the electoral votes, which made Joe Biden the president of the United States. Now let's listen to the moving testimony of one of the police officers on the scene.
What I saw was just a war scene. It was something like I'd seen out of the movies. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were officers on the ground, they were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, they had, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood. I was catching people as they fell. It was carnage, it was chaos.
The word carnage being used here, the word that was used actually by Donald Trump during his inauguration address in 2017, talking about that American carnage. A bit of a parallel there. How did that make you feel following that hearing there about that January 6th episode?
Yeah, of course, I don't think she intended to echo those words, but nobody can forget Trump's inaugural address on the Mall in Washington, in which he spoke about American carnage, and he became famous for that expression. And it's turned out to be fairly prophetic. And of course, several people were killed in the January 6th insurrection. At least from the first day's testimony, it seems that this commission has done a pretty thorough job at the investigation. If this was a court of law, I think it would be quite clear that they would have a very compelling prosecution case. But the problem is, it's not a court of law. It's the U.S. in perhaps the most divisive time in modern times. And one's inclined to think that half the Americans will simply ignore it and regard it as a politicized sideshow. And
Fox News, actually, one of the few networks in the U.S. not airing the hearings live. That really shows the level of division of public opinion and almost the existence of two separate realities, Stacey, in the U.S.
Yeah, as we've seen time and time again in the U.S., the two camps are deeply divided, and you would think that, a moment where we're taking stock over an event that, should be viewed as a national tragedy, you'd expect the needle of public opinion to be moved just a bit. But experience would teach us that, in fact, the camps tend to pretty much stay where they are. And we're heading into election season. We have midterms in November. And there's, there's the ability of the American right to portray the current hearing as, purely a sort of like campaign exercise.
There's a question for us journalists here, because so much of this is rooted in disinformation and misinformation. We saw these groups like the Oath Keepers or QAnon having such a big group here. What can we do in our job to try and get people to trust that there is one version of events?
I don't think there's much we can do, because unfortunately we're in an era which social media has just completely fragmented our ability to have a sort of unified narrative of events. So, we were all sitting there on January 6th watching it unfold in our various silos. And to a certain extent, we all had a front row seat. What's interesting about the current moment is that we're actually going to see a methodical attempt to reconstruct events. And I think it's an important exercise, regardless of whether it, succeeds politically.
Leila?
Well, I mean, as Vivian said, what we saw on the first day was the laying out of the case. But as Stacey says, there are some dates to keep in mind. We're heading into a midterm election, and Liz Cheney, the Republican co-chairman, she seemed to actually lay out a sort of a case for the prosecution should Attorney General Merrick Garland take it up. And then we are running into, the timeline of an election, which is, should Garland take this up? Should the Justice Department take it up as a criminal case? It's once again we run into this divisions in American society, which will be damned if you do, damned if you don't. There are many Democratic lawmakers who are getting increasingly frustrated, wondering if Donald Trump and his cronies and his allies will actually, face justice in a court of law. But this will, of course, be taken up by the people who will support Trump as a politicization of in an election cycle. And in the U.S., you have very narrow windows when you're not on an election circus. But as for this panel, it's going to be recorded in history. It seems to be a thorough case. And, at the very least, in the jury of history, this will be a very rigorous investigation into what happened. And for that, this is extremely important.
I think, sorry, if I could just say one other thing. I think that one of the most compelling arguments that Liz Cheney made was in appealing to Republicans, saying Trump is not always going to be around, and it's time for you to try and preserve your own political legacy. And I think that that is one of the few weapons that she has in her hand. I mean, she knows that the Republicans are smart enough to know that Donald Trump lost the election. That's not the question at hand. The question at hand is, are you going to stick with him or not? And her argument that it's time to cut loose, I think, is the one possibility that we have of breaking through this.
Dave Clark, is this panel, is this a public hearing just another step towards normality? Is this a sign that the U.S. is weathering a storm? How do you see this?
Hopefully that's not the message that people will take away from it. As the previous panelists have said, obviously the United States is in a very divided. It is two separate realities. And I don't think the Republicans will pay much attention to this. Liz Cheney's already been effectively exiled from her own party. And anyone who thinks they've got a political legacy hasn't burned it up to now. I don't know how many of those are left. But then the opponents of Trump, at least with something like this, which, in a sense will be preaching to the converted, people who already have a strong opinion about Trump, it is beginning to lay bare how well organized this was, and about how I hope they understand who their opponents are now. These are not the people who support democracy and the constitutional rule of law. Factions of them are heavily armed. They are organized via social media and also through ideological groups. So hopefully it's not a return to normality. I think the United States is always too quick to think they've got past their moment of crisis. They think that they can fight this threat to constitutional rule using the same weapons that they always have. The electoral politics, the normative effect of the mainstream media, the normative effect of coastal universities and so forth. I think they have to look at the evidence that comes out in this inquiry and face up to the fact that their opponents are not using the same tactics as they are.
Well, speaking of the evidence, there was quite a lot that was presented by the committee during that hearing. The people in the president's entourage who were trying to get him to back down and admit defeat, or at least those who now say that that's what they were trying to do. Let's listen in to former Attorney General William Barr and the president's daughter, Ivanka Trump.
I had 3 discussions with the president that I can recall. And in that context, I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, I didn't want to be a part of it. And that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did.
I respect Attorney General Barr. So I accepted what he was saying.
Stacey, it's hard to imagine that anything that Donald Trump is premeditated, but it was quite compelling, all the evidence that was presented during that hearing.
Yeah, listening to or watching that testimony, a question strikes me that pretty much would affect any journalist, which is, where were these people when the events were going on?
Exactly.
I mean, especially in the weeks and days leading up to it when you could have actually done something. And I think it's that, call to action has really been the failure, an institutional failure, but also a failure of character.
I think when as Vivian says, everybody's wondering, will the adults in the Republican Party stand up? And one thing to watch is at the end of all this, will some Republicans, cross the threshold of fear? Because right now there is a fear in the Republican Party of taking on Trump. And that's what we're in the land of liberty, in the land of free speech. There are, I suppose, a fair number of Republicans who know that this is a bad deal, but they are afraid to really take on Trump. And, the question now is, with this enormous amount of evidence, will that fear threshold get chiseled, or will, the base still move this party? And Liz Cheney is right now in the minority.
And if anything, Donald Trump's been emboldened. His comment about the hearings on his own social media platforms, or have been to describe what happened on January 6th as the greatest movement that the country has ever seen. Dave Clark, is Donald Trump basically the only option for the GOP today?
Well, the GOP that as it exists today is the Trump Party, and we've been waiting for how long is it now? 8 years for the adults in the Republican Party to stand up. I was in Washington during the Trump administration. I left before the end, but it was clear the direction it was traveling in, and I remember covering the U.S. State Department when Rex Tillerson was very frustrated with Donald Trump. He disappeared without trace and was replaced by Mike Pompeo, a yes man. I don't expect anything from them. That electoral politics in the United States is an extremely lucrative profession, and if you don't want to get primaried on the Republican side, then you have to more or less stick with the Trump side. If you were to tell the Republican voters that you're standing up against Trump because he is he's a criminal and a threat to society, you're also telling your own voters that they were stupid for going along with him for so long, and that you were too. And that's very hard for anyone to admit.
We'll have to move on to our next topic. Also in the world this week and the many weeks before that, the war in Ukraine and its ramifications for the rest of the world. The conflict there causing huge disruptions in world food markets, as both countries are huge producers of grain, oils, and fertilizer, among other things that are exported around the world. Ukrainian grain ready for export is stuck in Black Sea ports because the Black Sea is now a no-go zone. Negotiations underway in Turkey have shown little progress, leading to accusations that Russia is using grain as a bargaining chip. Let's listen to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking about this issue on Thursday.
Long-term painful sanctions must be applied globally against Russia because of this. There can no longer be any talks of Russia's continued membership of the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations. What does Russia do for the FAO organization if it is causing starvation for at least 400 million people and as much as 1 billion people?
Vivian, a global food crisis will increase pressure to find a settlement. Does that actually play into Russia's hand more?
Well, in a sense, yes. Much in the same way as the energy crisis has played into Russia's hand, because oil is now at $125 a barrel, and Russia is making more and more money off of its own oil. But that said, I mean, I think what President Zelensky hit on was the most incredible sort of ripple effects that this war is having. Just not just a food crisis, but certainly in our backyard, sitting here in Paris, you have North Africa heavily, heavily dependent on Ukrainian grain, with the risk of real famine in Africa. And I remember President Macron said this very early in the war, and everybody was like, what's he talking about? But in fact, here we are, nearly 4 months in, and it's clear that there are serious food problems compounded with and somewhat causing the inflation crisis in marginal countries whose economies can really not afford a rise in price and shortage of staples.
Stacey, how do you see this playing on the war, this food crisis?
How I see it affecting the conflict itself. I mean, it's hard to say. Obviously, it does give Putin an extra bargaining chip, but I have a feeling that it'll also probably lead to some sort of backlash that only reinforces his status as an international pariah. You disagree?
Well, I mean, we're in the realm of conjecture.
Right.
So I was just wondering about it. Because, I mean, what the war in Ukraine has also shown is that apart from what we call the West, which is Europe, the US, Australia, Japan, they have not, Asia and Africa and the quote-unquote non-aligned countries are not really with the West. And now that there's this food and famine and starvation, I am not so sure that, Putin will end up being his pariah status in the realm of public opinion. Will be further enhanced. I feel like there will be pressure coming from Africa and Asia and the developing countries, the global South, and Putin will come on top of this. I mean, if you heard, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov went to Turkey and he had a joint press conference with his Turkish counterpart. You listen to the rhetoric. Lavrov talking about imperialism, colonialism. He's feeding these things to Asia and Africa, regardless of the fact that what Russia is doing right now is imperialism. But the West has not managed to seize that narrative. And, we're still stuck. I mean, what we are seeing right now is that the global South is not on course with ideals. They are all looking out for interest. These are big countries, South Africa, India, Brazil, etc. And the narrative that what Russia is doing is very much imperialism. No, Moscow has completely seized that. They keep talking about colonialists and imperialists, and Africa and Asia is on his side. And, when there's a food crisis, I really don't think there's going to be that much of marginalization of Putin. They're going to buy whatever grain they can.
And a meeting where Sergei Lavrov is meeting with his Turkish counterpart to discuss finding potential solutions to this grain crisis and those exports not able to leave Ukraine. That picture, in a way, shows for the global South that there are easy solutions because Russia is the one saying, in its own words, that, well, we are proposing solutions. This the blockage is coming from Ukraine.
Yes, and you see the Turkish foreign minister just keeping quiet while Lavrov is just spinning this narrative, which, at the least he could have just said, I do not agree with this. So this is the messaging that is going out to the world, and Turkey's not. I doubt it's going to be able to, break the blockade. But on the stage of public opinion, Erdogan is just winning this round.
Dave Clark, do you see any positive outcome possible here?
Not in the immediate short term. No, this was gonna grind on. I very much agree that there is a problem in messaging from the defenders of Ukraine and when dealing with the global South. When people in Africa are short of bread, they're not going to care whether the grain that they're not getting is Russian grain or Ukrainian grain stolen by Russians, or grain isn't coming to them because one side's shelling the other or one side's mining its own harbors. You need food, and when people are thinking about hungry tummies, they're not going to be worried about whose fault it was, and they're going to be receptive to messages like Sergei Lavrov's. Here in Brussels, there's been a lot of diplomatic frenzy of attempting to counter this narrative, explaining that the war is the fault of the Russians, that the Russians are shelling grain silos, that the ships can't get out of Odessa because the Russians control the Black Sea. And it's clear that the diplomats here think they are losing that propaganda war. Now we need a practical solution to get any Ukrainian grain that remains out. And I noticed that President Macron and before him last week the British government as well were talking about practical ways of getting boats to Odessa, but that will be very difficult because both sides are part of the problem in Odessa. The Ukrainians have mined the port to defend their city. Quite understandable. They were fearful of an amphibious attack. So we'll have to clear the mines to get the boats in, and at that point they'll be vulnerable to Russian attack. So do Western vessels escort those boats, and does that bring us to a situation where there were European warships facing off against Russian warships in the Black Sea? It's a perilous situation, but it'll have to be a practical solution because I think in terms of the propaganda war, this is a bit of a win for Putin so far.
If I could just use
Sure.
one point of order.
Mackey Sole, the head of the...
Dave Clark,
Go
if you want to finish your thought, and then we'll pass it over to Stacey.
It was just that I was at the European Summit here last week, and Macky Sall, the current president of the African Union, came to discuss the issue with them shortly before he went on to Sochi and saw President Putin. And one of the things he told them there was that one of the issues they're having with buying Russian grain is that because of the European sanctions, the Russian banks that they need to pay for this grain are cut off from the SWIFT system. So these are sanctions brought in to hurt Russia, but obviously all economic sanctions have repercussions throughout the world economy.
Stacey?
No, I just wanted to clarify that I didn't mean to imply that the global South was somehow unwilling to buy Russian grain. I think the point I was trying to make was simply that if Putin goes and fuels a humanitarian crisis, a hunger crisis in the global South, it's going to deepen his isolation with the West, and it's going to make it harder and harder for the West to broker some kind of off-ramp with Putin. Any sort of diplomatic solution, which may already be far beyond reach, is just going to get further and further away. That's all.
3.5 months after the start of the war, and the world seems to have permanently changed. The latest shift taking place in European monetary policy since 2014, the European Central Bank had practiced monetary easing with negative rates in order to make access to capital easier and encourage healthy growth. But rising energy prices because of the war have brought on a new threat, inflation. Christine Lagarde, the ECB president, now announcing a rate hike in July, followed by another one a few months later. Well, sorry, Stacey. This change of tack from the ECB, what does this mean for the European economy, and especially for those countries like Italy, like Greece, that were the ones specifically kind of targeted by that previous policy of monetary easing?
Yeah, well, obviously the ECB is following in the footsteps of the Fed. But, during the pandemic, because of all the stimulus that was pumped into the economy, so much cash was put in, households' pockets, a considerable amount of savings built up. And as a result of that, or at least, theoretically, that's one element that could be fueling the inflation. So, if you're going to go and raise interest rates now, end easy money policy, it's going to at least force it's going to force people to start spending some of that cash, at least in theory.
Very well. And Russia taking grain hostage, as we said earlier, but also taking actual hostages in a way, or at least that's at least the British position regarding the arrest and sentence to death of 3 foreign fighters in the Ukraine army captured by Russian-backed forces and who were tried in a court in the Donetsk People's Republic, 2 British citizens and 1 Moroccan. This kind of tactic work?
I think it might well, yes. It certainly gives the Russians a bargaining chip with which to trade. And at this point, one could almost argue that that is needed, that both sides need bargaining chips. They need to start trading. They need to start figuring out what's next other than simply obliterating each other. The rates of casualties are really incredible. Just a couple of weeks ago, President Zelensky was saying that the Ukrainians were losing between 60 and 100 a day of their forces, and that figure is now being contradicted by one of his own advisors, saying that it's probably about double that. And the Russian losses on the other side appear to be in the tens of thousands. We're only 3.5 months into this war. It's very hard to imagine how long both sides can keep this up for. So bargaining chips, I think, is not a bad thing at all.
Leela?
I agree. I mean, unfortunately, we're down to this scenario. We are bargaining with human lives. And the fact that the Russians have 2 British citizens is a big chip for them, because Boris Johnson has been very upfront about supporting the Ukrainians. In fact, President Zelensky actually said that he was happy that Boris Johnson survived the no confidence vote. So the fact that Russia has 2 British nationals with them, this is definitely what what it's going to come down to, bargaining. On the other hand, the peace. I mean, the peace negotiations, such as they were, they did have some delegations meeting early after the invasion. That has stopped. But there are still committees that are meeting on both sides, Russian and Ukrainian sides, in order to get prisoner exchanges. So, that track is still open. And if there is to be some bringing of the 2 sides together, this is typically how, there could be an opening of some exchange. But this is all, I expect a lot of Western governments and other governments who have nationals fighting in Ukraine are going to be watching this very carefully, because, we don't want a situation where, French nationals, for instance, get into Russian captivity, and that, the diplomatic picture then gets very messy, because then you have families back home, pressuring for the release of their loved ones. So in a way, when these foreign fighters started, going to Ukraine, there was initially, governments were there was mixed messaging on it. The governments were not very keen to have their citizens, going as individuals, not officially going there. And this is the first. If I'm wrong, this is the first case of a foreign fighter being in Russian captivity. And, I have no idea if, we're going to see more of this.
Dave Clark, why the UK specifically in this particular case? Why do you think that country in particular was singled out for its support to Ukraine and not, for example, the United States?
It seems to be a propaganda line on Russian state TV that the real villain behind all of this Western resistance is Britain. It's something that Boris Johnson has played up to as well. He's very, very proud to be, the closest international friend of President Zelensky. There's streets named after him in Ukraine. He was welcomed on the streets when he made his visit. Both sides are happy for that propaganda element. It helps both sides' narratives at the moment. Obviously, in terms of actual military support to Ukraine, the United States is outspending everybody and has sent some of the most deadly weapons to the Ukrainian side. But the UK is behind that, obviously, but it's a much smaller country. But they have been sending some of the more effective anti-tank weapons and now the multiple launch rocket systems. But different countries in the West also have different cultures as regards the safety of their citizens abroad. And these unfortunate young men were volunteers. They went in there with their eyes open. They've got connections to Ukraine, and they were not operating as terrorists on the battlefield. They were members of the Ukrainian armed forces. And as I understand it, under the laws of war, countries are allowed to bring in foreign fighters if they're incorporated into their proper forces and not used as a kind of mercenary battalions. And that they should be accorded the POW status under the Geneva Conventions. That doesn't seem to be the case, although I'll note that they have been sentenced by the Luhansk regional government, which means that gives an opportunity for the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin to, sorry, my earpiece is coming out, to then step in and take over the case and then pretend to be some form of a mediator in this, which obviously would be a pretense. The Luhansk is, it's under the control of Russia now. But Britain has had a robust attitude to hostages in the past. There are some countries that would move heaven and earth to get hostages back, but Britain's stance in the past has always been that you can't allow whatever sympathy you feel for the families of these guys to alter policy.
And that story really adding more to the plate of Boris Johnson after a tough week for the UK Prime Minister. He was booed on his way to the Queen's Jubilee celebrations. We'll see those pictures as he's stepping up there. And then a vote of no confidence brought on because of a sizable minority within his own Conservative Party that wanted to see him gone. He survived with 211 votes out of 359. Let's listen to his reaction after that vote.
I think this is a very good result for politics and for the country. I do. Just in this sense, I think it's a convincing result, a decisive result, and what it means is that as a government we can move on and focus on the stuff that I think really matters to people.
Convincing? Decisive?
It's a little bit like our earlier conversation about Donald Trump. Here you have a party that has for so long basically stuck to its loyalties, with a leader that has really proven himself to be truly lacking in any sort of moral backbone. And it's all come to light now. And it's come to light over an issue that you would think is kind of marginal, given all the terribly urgent problems in the world. But breaking lockdown rules was something that truly irked people in a very, very deep way. It exposed him as being a kind of leader that did not regard the rules as pertaining to himself, very much like Donald Trump. And that simply has gotten people under people's skin. I think, unlike the Republicans in the US, you have a little bit more of a chance in Britain of this party really abandoning him. There are regional differences between North and South that could provide a kind of split in the party. And also, you had a lot of people last time around who brought Boris Johnson to power on basically because they disliked the alternative so much. They disliked the Labour Party's leader at the time so much. And that is no longer the case. So I think it appears to me he's in very bad trouble.
Dave Clark, beyond the Partygate and that controversy, what could be the other reasons for that rebellion within the Tory party? There was some talking, for instance, about disagreeing on his cost of living package that he proposed that they didn't see to be as fiscally responsible. What else? What other reasons are there?
Well, there is a lot of different opinions about how to approach the economic crisis within the Tory, within the Conservative Party, and obviously that played into the dissension with his rule. But in a way, that sort of strengthens him because the different factions can't see who would take over. One of the reasons why he got a majority, despite there's no warmth or trust for him within the party, but he got a majority because people weren't ready yet to pull the trigger on a leadership campaign. So the leadership campaigns have started very subtly or less subtly in some cases, but the leadership campaigns have begun, and if a front runner emerges that the party can get behind, then he will be in real trouble. But in the meantime, the disagreements about policy actually strengthen him because there's no clear faction leader that could replace him. Next week, we're going to see, finally, after many months of threatening, legislation to override the Northern Ireland Protocol, part of the withdrawal agreement with the European Union or the Brexit deal. They're going to get Brexit undone again, if you like. And the reporting that I'm seeing today suggests that Liz Truss has managed to get a very hard version of that law, one that will cause outrage here in Brussels and in Dublin. And this seems to be her showing her, her true Brexiteer credentials to the right of her party, the Frost faction and the European Research Group, the people who want to take a tough line with Brussels and with Dublin as regards the Irish Sea border. So this is finally someone in the cabinet who is beginning to put her head over the parapet, and we'll see whether that has any legs. Earlier, when Rishi Sunak was beginning to go on manoeuvres, there were leaks very quickly that almost destroyed his political career about his own wealth and so forth. So we'll see whether the Boris faction have got any dirt on Truss in the weeks to come, I imagine.
And Stacey, so Dave mentioned it on Monday, the Tory party presenting this amendment to the Northern Ireland Protocol to the House of Commons, in effect proposing changes to the hard-fought Brexit deal that took so long to get together. Is this the move right now for Boris Johnson?
Well, look, Boris Johnson's rise was built on Brexit. And to the extent that Brexit is in the rearview mirror, it's sort of a problem for him he doesn't want to address, or he's going to struggle to address the problems that are ahead of him, which is inflation and the cost of living crisis. The Tory party is split on how to address it. You have fiscal conservatives who want to see austerity. And on the other side, you have, Tories in blue-collar districts who want to see government spending. So how is Boris Johnson supposed to thread the needle on this? It's going to be interesting to watch.
Let's take a look at our final story of the day, a diplomatic spat between India and the Muslim world over comments made by leaders of the ruling Hindu nationalist BJP that were seen as blasphemous to Prophet Muhammad. We've seen marches in Bangladesh and Indonesia. Qatar, Kuwait, and Iran summoned Indian ambassadors to express their outrage. I'd like to express that outrage. Leela, you've covered this story. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the fact that the Indian government, the ruling party, is discriminates against Muslim and is Islamophobic is not new. What was new this time is that you had Gulf authorities officially, calling up, making official complaints to the Indian government. And what was new this time was that the BJP, the ruling party, had to act quickly. And so the spokeswoman who made these comments was fired, as was another BJP communications officer who tweeted her comments. And what's important here is that, we're looking at economics, because the BJP has had a rabidly Islamophobic and anti-Muslim policies, and the Gulf nations have pretty much not come to the help of Indian Muslims, like China's treatments of the Uyghur, because there's a lot of business here at stake. But when you have countries like Qatar, stating, their official opprobrium for what happens, this makes a difference to the Indian government, because you have millions of workers sending remittances worth billions of dollars into India. But the fact that, the BJP, will say that this is not our official policy, that we are not against the religion, and trying to paint an official spokesperson who's very much towing the official line as a fringe element, that is not going to wash at all. So, the Modi administration, after Modi was re-elected, pretty much took that re-election as a sort of mandate to implement the sort of policies that's long been in the works. And the fact that the West has not really reacted to this. The State Department can come out with a statement here and there. France says nothing. UK under Johnson is not going to say anything. So they took that as a mandate to just implement these policies, including amending the Constitution, changing citizenship laws that would go, unnoticed. And this is a very unlikely phenomenon that happened, where Gulf countries who are not the kind of authorities that would speak out about human rights have to give official declarations.
I'd like to flag one column from the Times of India that brings up an interesting argument, and you mentioned it already, an apparent double standard between Islamophobia in India, real and documented, and Islamophobia in China, real and documented as well, considering the human rights abuses against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Ashali Varma saying about the countries criticizing India, their silence on China is deafening, and it's certainly not helping the Uyghurs. But then it seems their criticism is only for democracies. Autocratic nations love their mirror image, even when it goes against their faith. Where's the difference in treatment here? How is there such a difference between how these countries treat India and China? They're both huge trading partners.
Look, a couple of things here. I don't think the Gulf nations came to support Indian Muslims. This was a confluence of factors, and it was an insult to the Prophet Muhammad, which is a different thing. Two, there are a lot of Indian nationals in the Gulf. This gets taken up on Twitter. This creates something that these authorities have to respond to. So that is very, very different, because the Twitter sphere of the Hindutva sphere is very active, much more so than what is happening in China. So, these governments are forced to react.
I'm really sorry, Leela. This is all the time we have. Thank you very much to all our panel. Dave Clark in Brussels from AFP, Vivian Wall, the Time Magazine correspondent, Stacey Mike Tree, the Paris bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. That was The World This Week. Stay tuned to France 24. More news coming right up.